Australia has historically identified itself as a seafaring nation. Its early colonization and settlement was accomplished only at the end of a very, very long sea voyage. So obviously ships and shipping were crucial to the lifeblood of Australia. Not surprisingly, Australia was among the first nations to recognize the historic importance of its shipwreck heritage, take steps to protect it. Some of the first steps occurred in the state I live in, Western Australia, with the passage of the Maritime Archaeology Act of 1973. That came about in an effort to protect remains of some of the old Dutch VOC shipwrecks that lie in waters off the state's coast in the Indian Ocean. These wrecks include the Batavia, notorious for the mutiny and massacre that followed shortly after the wreck itself, and one called the Gilt Dragon, which I can't quite pronounce the Dutch name, so we just call it the Gilt Dragon. A commercial salvage diver named Alan Robinson claimed to have found the Gilt Dragon while spearfishing with a group of friends one Sunday afternoon. His claim was contested by others in the group, including a local news photographer and his then teenage son named Graham Henderson on that same spearfishing trip. The photographer claimed his son had actually spotted the encrusted metal cylinder that later proved to be a cannon from the long-lost shipwreck. The Hendersons deeded any claim they may have had in the wreck to the Western Australian Museum. In fact, young Graham went on to become the first director of the Western Australian Maritime Museum some years later. And he wrote a 3-volume series of Western Australian shipwreck histories called Unfinished Voyages. Fourth volume is in the works now that Graham has retired from the museum, so he's had quite a career. For his part, Robinson claimed salvage rights in the wreck, which was of great commercial value owing to the huge quantity of silver coins that the ship carried. Because the Maritime Archaeology Act vested the property in the wreck and its cargo in the Western Australian Museum, extinguishing Robinson's salvage claim, Robinson challenged the legislation in the federal court. In a somewhat incoherent decision, the High Court of Australia struck down the state legislation as it applied to this wreck in Robinson and Western Australian Museum. The thrust of the court's reasoning, once you get to it, was that while the state could regulate, for example, commercial fishing in the adjacent sea, the subject matter of the Maritime Archaeology Act, i.e. protecting historic shipwrecks lying seaward of the low water mark, was beyond the legislative competence of the state parliament as opposed to the federal parliament. There's a state-federal tension here. Well, meanwhile, the federal parliament was watching this case with great interest and concern. Australia was becoming very interested in its history in general and its maritime history in particular, with the planning for the 1980 celebration of the bicentennial of the arrival of the first fleet of convicts, which was really the beginning of the settlement of Australia 200 years earlier. So suddenly Parliament was thinking, well, maybe we should do something more than just let people salvage things. The federal parliament feared the decision of the High Court allowing salvage of this wreck would allow wholesale plunder of all of the historic shipwrecks in Australian waters. To forestall this, Parliament enacted the Historic Shipwrecks Act in 1976, which protects as cultural relics all shipwrecks in Australian waters more than 75 years old. Now, as predicted, the High Court struck down the state legislation, and the next day, the Historic Shipwrecks Act came into effect, which pretty much nullified Robinson's salvage victory. Some of the main provisions of the Historic Shipwrecks Act and conceptual problems, it extends blanket protection to any shipwreck more than 75 years old lying within waters of Australia. Younger shipwrecks can be gazetted by declaration of the relevant minister if it has some reason. For example, the recent discovery of the HMS Sydney was a major historical moment in Australia. It was lost with all hands, virtually without a trace in 1941. Recently, with some high-tech search equipment, they found it lying about 2,500 meters of water, and it's now been declared as a protected ship under the Act. The Act requires that a register of historic wrecks and relics be maintained, but registration or designation is not required for a wreck if it's more than 35 years old, as protection is automatic from the moment of discovery. The Act also prohibits salvage of such wrecks flat out. Incidentally, a law of fines it's never been recognized in Australia, so that wasn't really an issue. Section 21 of the Act provides for compensation if for some reason by operation of the Act someone's deprived of a property right. Compensation is available. I'm only aware of this being tested once, which kind of suggests that even the salvage right isn't quite recognized quite so strongly. The Act imposes fines for damaging wrecks protected by the Act. Removal of relics from a protected wreck is also prohibited. This Act, along with other Australian legislation, prohibits the export of cultural artifacts such as shipwreck relics. The Act allows designation of no entry zones around protected shipwreck sites, up to an 800-meter radius around the site. The Act extends to any wreck found in Australian waters out to the limit of the continental shelf. Now, after our discussions about the law of the sea, you'll see the immediate problem there in that apart from the right to fish or seek other natural resources in the outer continental shelf, the coastal state doesn't have jurisdiction to do what this Act purports to do. That's a bit of an issue when other states wouldn't necessarily recognize the Historic Shipwrecks Act beyond the territorial sea. Patrick O'Keefe and Lindell Pratt explored this in great detail in a 1978 article in the Australian Yearbook of International Law, and concluded that only an international convention could secure such protection in the EEZ. As we all know, Patrick and Lindell had went on to devote much time and energy over the next 2 decades to see the adoption of the 2001 convention. Aside from the problem of enforcing the Act in the exclusive economic zone, the Act has worked out well elsewhere in the waters of Australia. The Commonwealth has an active historic shipwrecks program. It's managed by the Department of Sustainability, Environment, Water, Population, Communities. They keep rejuggling the department names, but it's very active. It's chronically underfunded. I think last year it received $440,000 Australian. This is for the entire coastline of Australia. It's believed there are some 7,000 shipwrecks in Australian waters, and that's literally dropped in the ocean to try to do any sort of meaningful research. But the states struggle on. They do manage to do some meaningful work. The program does tend to fund less glamorous work of maintaining collections, doing field work, managing the permit system, and administrative tasks. For example, the shipwrecks program offered no funding to the finding the Sydney, which was a major effort, although the Australian Navy, because it was a warship, kicked in quite a bit of money. There's corresponding state legislation. All the Australian states have jurisdiction over their enclosed coastal waters and also internal waters. State legislation is generally similar to the Commonwealth legislation, but some minor differences. For example, the Commonwealth Historic Shipwrecks Act protects any ship older than 75 years. Western Australia's Maritime Archaeology Act protects only those shipwrecks that occurred prior to 1 January 1900. It's a bit short-sighted because now we're coming up to ships sunk since then that are clearly of historic interest. In New South Wales, their legislation protects any wrecked ship or associated relic that was manufactured more than 50 years ago, regardless of when the shipwreck event took place. Some differences between the Australian legislation and the UNESCO Convention. All the Australian legislation, federal and state, seeks to protect shipwrecks and associated relics. So protection of relics allows for some creativity in extending protection to UCH sites that are not strictly speaking shipwrecks. For example, Fremantle's Long Jetty has long since been a ruin site. The surrounding artifact scatter zone is a protected site because it can easily be established from ship logs and harbormaster records that many of the known shipwrecks in the area berthed at the jetty at some point. This established a sufficient nexus between shipwrecks and the jetty. Also, survivors' camps on dry land that can be attributed to a particular shipwreck can also be protected under state and or Commonwealth legislation. However, neither the federal act or none of the state acts can protect anything such as a submerged aircraft or underwater structures, other cultural material of historic significance. For example, the Western Australian Act could not be stretched to protect sunken remains of World War II Dutch and British seaplanes that were strayed and sunk by Japanese aircraft in 1942 after seaplanes had stopped overnight to refuel at Broome in the state's northwest. Protection of this site was achieved through the Heritage of Western Australia Act, which is generally applied to terrestrial sites of post-contact built heritage. And just incidentally, that's what I do now, is I administer the Heritage of Western Australia Act and built heritage. Another area lacking in the historic shipwrecks is a provision to establish a criminal offence in Australia for Australian nationals or Australian-flagged vessels carrying out salvage work in the EEZ and other signatory states, or for providing chandlery to salvage vessels engaged in such work. Prospects for ratification are actually pretty good. Australia is actively considering ratification, and they've recently undertaken a review of all the relevant legislation to see what has to be fixed in order to ratify the UNESCO Convention. Basically, it's As you might expect, the extending protection to all forms of UCH, not just shipwrecks, ensure that human remains found at UCH sites are treated appropriately, enable the seizure of UCH relics imported into Australia, if not legally sanctioned by the country of origin. Currently, that's not prohibited. Ban future trade in UCH relics, newly discovered relics. Provide a stability for Australia to assert its shared management interests on UCH sites not lying in Australian waters, and also enable Australia to enter into bilateral arrangements with other states in regard to the management of UCH lying in both Australian and non-Australian waters for their shared patrimony. A good example is Turkey and the Black Sea. With the Gallipoli landing is very important in the history of Australia, so Australia now works with Turkey on. They've recently discovered some landing barges sunk off the Anzac Cove landing site. Turkey recognizes that Australia clearly has an interest in this. And they require Australian vessels and nationals to treat also UCH in other countries as they're required to do in Australia. Good provisions for reporting, ensure consistency across other legislation. For example, there's a great deal of legislation in Australia protecting indigenous heritage. To the extent that's found underwater, that also needs to be brought into conformity. I'll ask you to touch base on a couple of issues, the role of the private sector and cooperative agreements. Private sector, aside from a few consulting contracts or a lot of lease of specialized high-tech equipment, there has not been a lot of engagement with the private sector in managing UCH in Australia. I think this reflects the nature of Australia's shipwrecks as much as anything. Unlike the Caribbean, where you have centuries of Spanish shipwrecks going back to the Old World with New World booty, Australian waters do not have a significant number of so-called treasure shipwrecks. So there's very little commercial incentive for the private sector to seek to get involved in UCH management research, other than some government research project. There are only 5 or 6 known shipwrecks in Australia that carry a significant amount of gold, silver, or riches. These would be the 4 known VOC shipwrecks. And it's believed there are 2 or 3 others in Australian waters. There was an American ship called the Rapid that was carrying quite a bit of silver coinage. And there was one other ship, I think the Niagara. Anyway, you could count on 2 hands the number of ships that are known or thought to have significant amount of treasure. So private sector and salvage interests really haven't been that eager to get involved. That said, the private sector has been very helpful. The petroleum industry, for example, has a lot of specialized equipment for offshore exploration. And occasionally they'll loan this equipment or their research data to the WA Museum to carry out research tasks. And quite often, as a condition of approval, a component of an offshore project will be required to conduct field survey to identify possible wreck sites on the UCH. For example, Chevron recently committed to spending $29 billion to build an LNG plant, and they were required to conduct some offshore research, which located a recently unknown jetty at the site of where the LNG tankers are going to pull up. So they've been doing some rescue archaeology at that site. International cooperation. The Australia actually entered into an agreement with the Netherlands regarding these 4 Dutch shipwrecks. That was a precursor to the Historic Shipwrecks Act and actually formed an impetus for the Act. Australia has also entered into a bilateral MOU with the U.S. in 2010 to provide for cooperation of UCH resource management in the Pacific. This is quite interesting because it allows exchange of staff. For example, a grad student in Australia can come and work in a NOAA facility, and vice versa. Excuse me. Outside of formal agreements, a lot of cooperative informal work has been done. For example, I mentioned the Gallipoli landing site. There's also an Australian submarine, the AE-2, that successfully traversed the Dardanelles during the First World War, where it was sunk in the Sea of Marmara. And the Turkish government's been very cooperative with largely a volunteer effort by Australian archaeologists to explore and document both the AE-2 and the Gallipoli landing site. Finally, there's been a cooperative training program for some years in operation in Sri Lanka at Malacca Harbour. The Western Australian Maritime Museum has established a lengthy and good working relationship, and they've recently set up a training program to train qualified underwater archaeologists from throughout Southeast Asia. In a nutshell, that's what's happening in Australia. Thank you.